The lesson topic for this video is Geometry Vocabulary, Terms, Notation, and Diagrams. Well, hello and welcome to what is probably your first video lesson for this course. We are going to start off with just some vocabulary, some of which you're probably familiar with, but also the notation and symbols we use for the vocab in diagrams. And just all of this will be used kind of during the whole year of geometry. So let's get started. The first term we're going to discuss is the term point. Now, point is a location on a diagram. Each labeled point in this diagram to the left, A and H and D and all of those are all points. And typically we write point by simply using actually the word point and then a capital letter, for example, point A. So this is point A. There are also infinite points on this diagram. This is also a point. It's just not labeled. This is a point up here. It's just not labeled. But the points that are labeled are the ones we'll typically use in our examples anyways. So that's point A. Now, the next term, line, is a set of points, an infinite set of points. Now, that means it never ends. So it goes infinitely, right? Set of points extending in two directions. This right here is a line. There's arrows on the ends. It goes infinitely that way, and there are some points labeled on this line right now, G, D, F, and E. Again, I want to point out there's also a point here. There's also a point here, there's one over here, and there's a bunch down that way. So there's an infinite number of points on there, even though there's only 4 labeled. So that's something I like to point out. A line is always labeled with 2 of those points that are on the line. So in this situation, I can pick any point, 2 points on that line. I'm going to pick G and D. So if I write G and D, and then I put this double-headed arrow over the top of it, that represents line GD. So that's this line here because G is on it and D is on it. And there's no other line that has those 2 points. I could have also called this line GF or line GE. I could have called it DF, DE. There's so many, and then we could go the other direction with our letters, so FD or FG as well. So there's a lot of ways to name this line. There's actually another way to name that line, and I'm going to write it over here. Let's say line L. Now notice I used a cursive L right here because of that L right there. So a lot of times there's going to be a little cursive letter at the end by the arrow. That's another way to name the line. So that's also line L. Notice this line doesn't have one of those letters on the end, so we couldn't call it anything other than line CD, CH, DH, and things like that for that line there. Now you'll notice where this line L intersects this line, line CD, we've got one point that is in common between both of those lines. That is called the intersection of those lines. An intersection is the set of points that 2 or more figures have in common. So this figure, this line, and this figure, this line, intersect at D. So in this case, we say D is the intersection between those lines. Now, a segment is a portion of a line. So we go back to this line here and we talk about a portion of a line that has 2 endpoints, let's say F and E. So it's a part of a line that has 2 endpoints. It goes from F to E. It doesn't go infinitely in either direction. That is a segment. So let's use just green here and talk about that segment FE. And we would notate that by writing FE with a segment over top of it. So that's segment FE. I could also call that segment EF. But notice I can't call it anything else because I can't use a letter D this time. Remember how I told you this line could be named in a lot of different ways. This segment can only be named in 2 ways. Now, a ray is also a part of a line, but it has an endpoint and then it goes infinitely in one direction. So if I were to talk about, let's pick this one right here, ray DC. I'm going to write that. You always start with the end point and then end where towards where the arrow is when you name a ray. Okay, so I can start at D and head towards C, and then my ray notation looks like that. So this right here is ray DC. Now I cannot call that ray CD because ray CD would actually start at C and go towards D and then keep going infinitely this direction. So that's a different ray than that ray right there. Okay, now angle. An angle consists of two rays with the same endpoint. So if we looked at this ray right here, ray DH, and with that same endpoint, right, I start with D and go towards G, that will create an angle. And you guys are probably familiar with angles, so that isn't a big surprise, but that is the definition with our new vocab in there about rays. So when we name an angle, we almost always end up using three letters. And I'll talk about that again in a second, but we're going to use an angle symbol, and then we're going to use three letters, 1, 2, 3. And it is important that you realize that the center letter, when you're naming an angle, must be the vertex of the angle. The vertex of the angle is that endpoint that we talked about that both rays come from. So we're going here and we're going here. That's the vertex. That point must be the center letter when we name an angle. So the D has to go there. Now, it doesn't matter what two letters we put here and here from that angle, as long as, I mean, it's from the two rays that create the angle. So this ray has a G, this ray has an H, and so we're going to use those two letters to name it as well. So G and H. So that's angle GDH. We could have also called this angle HDG. That is the same angle. Again, the vertex is the one that has to stay in the center. In some cases, an angle might be drawn, let's just say like this somewhere in a picture without additional rays. And then if there's, let's say, a K right here, you could call that simply angle K, but you can't if there are additional rays touching this vertex here. So notice, again, this D point right here also has another ray here and here. So we can't just call it angle D. If we called it angle D, people would be like, do you mean this angle D over here, or this angle D here, or this angle D here, or this one here? Which is why we use the three letters. If an angle is standing alone, just two rays and that's it, then we can call that angle K. All right. Now, all of these images or figures that we just went over are all on this diagram that is a diagram of a plane with some points, lines, rays, and segments on it, right? So a plane is a flat two-dimensional surface. Typically, we use a parallelogram, though it doesn't have to be. It could be a square or rectangle. Again, in this case, it's a parallelogram. Now, I mentioned this letter M earlier and how it's not a point. It's actually, since it's a capital letter in the corner of a plane, we can name it, name this plane, plane M. Let me grab a different color quick. All right, so we can call this plane M. Sometimes there isn't a letter in the corner, and when that is the case, what we're going to do is we're going to name it with any three points that are on the plane, as long as they are not all on the same line. Okay, so this line right here has 4 points on it. We cannot name the plane GDF because that wouldn't actually define this plane specifically. And there's more to that later we'll talk about. But for now, just know that we would have to choose any three letters from the plane that are not all on the same line. So let's call this plane BFH. There's a lot of options. I just chose B, F, and H, knowing they're not all on the same line. Okay, so here is another diagram that is similar but somewhat different than the one we just discussed. One thing I'd like to point out before you start these questions is this dotted line, this portion of the line that's dotted here, what that represents is that this line, this green line, is intersecting the plane at this point and it's going behind it. So if you picture this as a pencil that is being, that you punched a hole through a piece of paper and it's kind of going through the paper, that's what this is showing. So this part is behind the plane, this part is above the plane, and then this part is part that you can see that's also below the plane. So hopefully that makes sense. It's like a three-dimensional way we show things. So I'd like you to pause the video, answer these questions on a piece of paper, truly write your answers down, and then check back to see how you did after you've completed that. Okay, go ahead and take a look at the answers I wrote in here and let me know at any point when we connect about questions you have about these answers.